Good morning. I'm Carrie Benish. I'm professor of medieval and Renaissance history, as well as urban studies at New College of Florida. And I chaired the committee that selected this year's prize for an early career article on medieval or pre-modern Italian history from the Society of Italian Historical Studies. With me on the 2024 committee were Joshua Burke of Mount Holyoke College and Nicholas Terpstra from Victoria College at the University of Toronto. With me today, here on the Zoom, is Rachel Midura, Assistant Professor of Digital and Early Modern European History at Virginia Tech. Our committee awarded an honorable mention to Rachel for her article, "They Hide from Me Like the Devil from the Cross: Transalpine Postal Routes as Intelligence Work, 1555 to 1645, which was published in History, the Journal of the Historical Association in 2023. It's pages 303 to 327. Our commendation read as follows. Midura's analysis of the seemingly banal documentation of early modern postal routes between Italy and the Holy Roman Empire reveals how strategic battles over information security during the 30 Years' War affected military tactics and international relations on a broad scale. Midura's lively account confirms that espionage, covert ops, and disinformation campaigns are not inventions of the modern day. So, with that introduction over, I will mostly hand things over to Rachel at this point. And Rachel, if you want to start just by giving me any reaction that you have to the specific praise in the citation that we wrote.
Thank you. Well, I want to begin by thanking you and the rest of the committee for this honor. I really appreciate the honorable mention for my article. I also wanted to thank Danielle Shaw, who first gave the opportunity to contribute to this special issue, which focuses on early modern espionage. This was a great opportunity to really get to work through some ideas with relation to intelligence services. So I think one thing that always makes me laugh with this project is that people often wonder, how did you end up with such a specific or even boring topic as postal history? And that in itself, to me, is an indication of how successful this historical propaganda campaign was to essentially make these postal services seem really boring and therefore much more trustworthy than they might otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Than they might otherwise have been, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how, given that it seems boring perhaps from the outside, how did you get interested in this material? Can you give us a little bit of background?
Yeah. So I am the daughter of an American diplomat, and I grew up overseas in Europe in part. And I always like to say that because I think that's where my interest in these expatriate communities and, types of official and unofficial diplomacy operations really originates from. My father was at different times a cultural affairs officer and a press officer. And so when I started my dissertation, I actually intended to focus on Italian language newspapers and the advent of news culture as we know it in the early modern period. I was really fortunate to work with a great committee on my dissertation, which I was doing at the time. Paula Finland, my advisor, was the one who suggested maybe looking at this Tassis family because they seem to be everywhere. And because these postal routes were so key for newspapers to develop. So that's kind of where I started from. It took me down a really long and interesting path.
And one of the things that I think struck the committee so much about the article was that you took this one sort of, again, seemingly not that interesting bureaucratic piece of evidence, but contextualized it with all of these other pieces of evidence from all over the place, which I think is more understandable now that I've heard a little bit more about the background. But can you talk a little bit about those sources and about how you came to merge all of these different sources together to create a picture of postal history that is much more vibrant and lively than I think most people tend to think?
Yeah, well, I think, going back to, growing up overseas, I think I'm keenly aware of the fact that diplomacy is done by people and people who sometimes have their own axe to grind, as we see in this particular set of stories. So I was very fortunate. This was research that I did over the course of about 2017 to 2019 when I was doing the dissertation. I was very fortunate that the Post as a category is one that especially 19th century archivists tended to divide sources into. So they were interested in the study of domestic infrastructure, for example. The issue with that is that a lot of these postmasters in residence were not necessarily included in that. So an example from the article is Ferdinando Tassis, who was the imperial postmaster in residence in Venice, tasked with making sure that, imperial mail crossed the Brenner route, essentially. Um, so in order to get those stories, it was much more necessary to look to diplomatic sources, to dispatches, but also look to the Tassis family sources, which are luckily kept at the Turn and Taxis archives in Regensburg Archive and Library. So this is a family that, while originally Bergamasco, become the German nobility of Turn and Taxis. So really, this was a project that took me all over to follow these agents of mobility in my own mobile way.
And one of the things that I think we really appreciated about your article was the way in which you synthesized all of these different pieces of evidence to try to create a larger picture of what was going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about the benefits or challenges of research in multiple languages with different points of view, where sometimes you might have 3 or 4 or 5 sources for an event that all contradict one another?
Yeah. So I think this is really key for the study of a history of intelligence, where there's oftentimes a very deliberate effort to keep things from becoming documented in the first place. And so what we have is a kind of famine, or what's the term? Rags or riches,
Feast
feast
or
or
famine.
famine. Yeah, exactly. A situation where, we might have nothing for 100 years and then an amazing amount of documentation that's kind of thrown together in surrounding, for example, an intelligence leak, right? Something that, or a set of intercepted letters. And so I think a lot of what I ended up needing to do was look to these multilingual sources, look to these different points of view to get a better sense of what the day-to-day may have actually been like, rather than the kind of frantic effort to deal with individual incidents. And again, like, it's those incidents that also become much more drawn out affairs, like the story of the Frankfurt postmaster that I tell in this article, where, yes, on the one hand, we have this one instance of where he's accused of being a spy, right? But in fact, by kind of drawing out the story and telling all these familial elements, telling this much longer legal campaign that he wages, we get a sense of how actually this was a little bit more, daily business in a way, right? The struggle of these postmaster lieutenants to kind of wrest their own control within the system of censorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the nature of archival practice, which is something that my students always get really interested in, is like, well, why do we have these sources and how did those sources end up over here? And I think it's something that comes out very interestingly in your article, where you have, Germans living in Venice and Spanish people living in Milan. And how do you think the archives reflect these very widespread international networks?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I've noticed is that you can actually access a lot of great information by looking at sources that are not in the language of the host institution or the default language. So, for example, the Turn and Taxis archives are really rich in this Italian language material, but it's been, and because the Tassis were originally Italian, it's been underutilized by comparison to sources that tell the more familiar 19th century story of the advent of domestic infrastructure. So I think there's a real value to looking at these expatriate communities, both for what they tell us about this kind of cosmopolitan pan-European network, but also for making very explicit the kinds of controls that are increasingly being enacted on foreign residents or the category of foreign, right? What is that meaning to the individuals who are themselves perhaps foreign and yet pointing the finger at others and saying, well, no, those are the foreigners you need to be worried about.
Yeah. And also I think that when you look at these sources in multiple languages, sources that present situations from multiple points of view, where you see contradictions gives you a sense of what's not being said. Can you give us an example or two of situations that you found like that you thought were particularly illuminating?
Yeah, so this is derives from the book project as opposed to the article, but it's connected. So the Spanish postmasters in Milan are walking an interesting line a lot of the time between the Spanish governor and the local Milanese systems of governance and nobility. As well as their own employees who tend to be a mix of, from Milan or from surrounding areas. So there is a big audit at the beginning of the 17th century, which is
And
very
people think that
concerned.
audits are new.
No, very much so. They're being done in a different way in the 17th
Sure.
century, but yeah, the concerns are essentially the same, which is that there's been, misuse of funds, perhaps hiding things in the actual postal ledgers, and especially giving preferential service to businessmen. And the businessmen of Genoa, who are a concern for the Spanish crown, even as they become increasingly reliant on them. And so
Someone
that's a
who studies the Genoese, I have to say it's always the Genoese.
right, right. No, I have a great quote of at least one of the Spanish counselors saying, the Genoese, I couldn't have enough blood of theirs on my hands. So yeah, no love lost there. And the post office again is having to constantly walk that line of serving the Spanish crown, but needing to fund themselves, right? Because the Habsburgs aren't always coming through at the beginning of the 17th century. So in any case, that audit leads to all of these interviews and defenses, which present very different takes and from people who have a real personal stake in how how the actual circumstances are documented.
So was this essentially a situation of sort of what the couriers said versus what the postmaster claimed?
Yes,
Those the
absolutely. And
perspectives that you're getting there?
yeah, so in this case, it's a postmistress and her postal lieutenant who are defending the need to fund the office essentially by offering this, private mail carrying and, probably taking some bribes. Um, and then on the other hand, what's interesting is we see the couriers arguing that they're being not, that they are increasingly taking part in a gig economy without the kinds of social security that they would like. But also that, complaints that there's more going on the ground than the Spanish officials are aware of.
Mhm. And how do you get any sort of clear sense of how particularly the postmasters and postmistresses are dealing with that perhaps tension between the need to be a reputable, upstanding public official with their other life as spy masters or intelligence officers or, sneaky informants?
Yeah.
How did people deal with that sort of bifurcation?
I think it's really interesting how technocrats are themselves public relations managers. So they're doing this intelligence service, but they're also managing the image more generally for the post office and via the post office for the state, right? Particularly its executive figures. So to me, they're really two sides of the same coin, censorship on the one hand, propaganda on the other. These are information professionals who are in a prime position to control both the content of information as well as its overall flow and reception.
And how do you, I mean, those are concepts that we see in the news virtually every day today. How do you make that leap or encourage your students to make that leap to realizing that questions of information control, of disinformation campaigns, of propaganda, that these are not modern phenomena, that they go way back, and that may or perhaps should inform how we understand these trends today?
Yeah, so actually one of my favorite classes to teach here at Virginia Tech is a history of espionage and surveillance, where I try to do
My son
exactly
would
that.
love to take that.
So we begin in antiquity and we go all the way to World War One. And really what it comes down to is that these are fundamentally human systems, right? Where the architecture of the state is important because of the opportunities it offers for individuals who are often seeking interests that can align with the state, but can also diverge. So from my point of view, the postmasters are technocrats. I think there's a tendency in the modern day to see the rise of communications moguls to political positions, or the effort by said moguls to influence communications as aberrant, or somehow breaking a pattern, unprecedented, when in fact the technocrats that we employ to manage information are in exactly the right position to transition to political power. So I think that is a point that I really try to get across to students, is to consider the fact that control of information is so key across time.
Mhm. And how you mentioned a book project. Do you want to
Mhm.
tell us a little bit more about that and where it's going and when it's coming out?
Yes, thank you. Yes, the book project is Postal Intelligence, the Tassis Family and Communications Revolution in Early Modern Europe. It should, knock on wood, be out in the coming March 2025 from Cornell University Press.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
And what are you working on next? Where do you think this is going to go? Is this more postal history? Are you just going sort of looking at a different aspect of the same thing? Are you going to move into something totally different, or where do you think you're going to go with this?
Yeah, so while I still have plenty of material to work on with regards to postal history, I think I've really gotten bitten by the intelligence history bug. So my next project, a second tentative book project, is The Age of Conspiracy, Treason, Assassination, and the Hunt for Angelo Badaware. So
Who is Angela Badaware?
Angelo Badaware is a Venetian nobleman who turns traitor and starts feeding state secrets to the Spanish ambassador and the papal nuncio at the beginning of the 17th century. So he's found guilty of this and flees Venetian authorities, and is pretty much on the run for the next 20 years. Um, and the reason that I came across him was because the Venetians are using their postal network to track his whereabouts and try to arrange either
Ah.
extradition or assassination. Um, and so this made me aware of the extent to which these kinds of communications networks are being activated across Europe, right? But for better and for worse. That I think these same networks that give rise to kind of a pan-European obsession with conspiracy are also extending the horizon of these kinds of extraterritorial acts of state, including assassination.
Fascinating. Well, I wish you very good luck with that. Um, and we will all look forward to what you find. Is there anything else we ought to cover before we wrap this up?
Let's see. I think the only other thing I wanted to comment on, just as being cool, is the role of postmistresses. Um,
Yes,
I,
absolutely.
I often get questions about this, and I think that's one of the most interesting things that's come out of this project, is learning just how normal it was to have a postmistress. And these are women who are in positions, again, as I've been emphasizing, of amazing access to politically sensitive information. And it's not questioned. And I think there's a whole story there about the role of women in communications trades, which, there's a lot of great work coming out now on women in print, for example.
Sure.
Um, but women are playing this role with regards to these manuscript communications networks as well.
Hmm. Well, great. Well, maybe that can be the subject of the third book.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel Midura, for talking to us about your article about postal systems and intelligence work in the 17th century. Um, and we will look forward to seeing how things go in the future.
Thank you so much.